going to call this meeting of the legislative committee together.
It's like 5-6 times a week.
And it's 1 p.m. on Friday, November 8th, and we'll do introductions starting over here on my right.
Crystal Kennedy.
Pete Peterson.
Suzanne LaFrance.
Christopher Constant. Forrest Dunbar.
Austin Quinn Davidson. Meg Zalatow.
Felix Rivera.
And John Weddleton is somewhere in the building. I see his water bottle and jacket still there, so he'll probably be back momentarily. And so we're going to try to go over some ideas that we might want to take to the legislature. Past years, we would be advocating for capital projects. That would be the vast majority of what the legislative committee and legislative program would be about. And we are still going to be advocating for getting a bond on the ballot next November, a general obligation bond to fix ports all over the state, and that's a resolution we are forwarding through the Alaska Municipal League, and it's in the process right now. And we'll see how that goes. But looking at our agenda here, I've copied a couple of items that were forwarded to me by committee chairs, that items that their members of their committee had brought up that might be something that we might include in our legislative program. So I'm wondering if there's someone from the co-chairs of the Health Policy Committee that would like to go over what we have listed under number A right there, see what the request might be. Ms. LaFrance?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I guess I would ask if anyone has any particular questions as Ms. Quinn Davidson is coming back in the room. I mean, probably the system funding issues at the state level might be one that raises some questions, and that especially has to do with behavioral health and the state having the mechanisms for funding and how it works without having like a county level in between in terms of what responsibilities the city ends up taking on. But I'm just asking if anyone has any questions. And that, wow, you put that in verbatim.
Mr. Rivera.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I see Medicaid is important. Aside from that, I think this would fit in the Health Policy Committee portion because the substance misuse report talked about alcohol taxes. I think there is a relatively simple, two requests on the state side. First is a request for an audit, a state audit, to get the efficacy and understand the efficacy of the different programs that are funded by the state alcohol tax, whether those programs are actually effective or not. I hear varying degrees here when talking with folks about it. And then the second is exploring a language change, and I think we could hand this to the legislature so it's pretty simple for them, on how we can get a more equitable share of the state alcohol tax. Many members have seen this already. It's been passed around to several assembly members. A look at where the alcohol tax is being spent, and their analysis being done to determine whether we're actually getting our fair share of it or not. And I think it's probably everyone's basic assumption that we're probably not getting our fair share of the state alcohol tax. And so I think there's probably a simple language change that we can ask the state to do that will give us a more fair share, and other jurisdictions as well.
So we'd be hoping to get our share of the alcohol taxes that the state collects here in Anchorage. And we would expect them to send all that to us, or half of that to us, or what's the idea there? What are we shooting for?
So I don't know exactly what the formula would look like, but if you were to analyze the money now versus what it might look like, it's pretty out of proportion. So adjusting the formula so that the money that is spent in Anchorage and sent from Anchorage to the state general fund, that some significant portion of that comes back to Anchorage for the work that needs to get done.
Well, and there is probably a good segment of the public out there that thinks that the alcohol taxes that they pay when they buy alcohol locally goes to Anchorage, which actually in reality it doesn't. It goes to the state of Alaska, and it goes right into their general fund. And so if it goes into their general fund, they can spend it however they like. And so most people are surprised when they hear that, because they think that the city is collecting all this money and then we're not spending it on treatment facilities that we need and problems with public inebriates and things like that. And so there's probably needs to be a little education as to the reality of the situation as well. Ms. Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I don't know, maybe Mr. Rivera has more comments on this, but I would even caution using the term fair, because, obviously if we look at it in terms of population percentages, we might have 40% of the population here, but we probably have a much higher percentage of people who need treatment. So just because we happen to be the hub for a lot of those kinds of facilities and opportunities and things like that. So has there been any conversation about how to make it not necessarily equitable but appropriate?
You want to respond to that, Mr. Rivera?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that makes sense, especially with the conversations that we've been having about how we are really the hub for a lot of these different issues. And I think particularly for this one, we are a big hub for the issue and severely underfunded, and we don't have the beds that we need. And so I would be amenable to framing it in some type of different way so that it's we take the sort of the fairness, equity, and just fund what we need in Anchorage. Yeah.
Well, and the reality of the situation is, since their budget is, they're looking at deficits and holes in their budget, so the chances of them sending us a larger percentage of the alcohol taxes they collect are probably relatively slim, I would imagine. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't continue to broach that subject and make sure they understand that we don't think we're getting a fair shake on that deal, and I don't think the other jurisdictions around the state that they're collecting alcohol taxes for are totally satisfied about that situation either. Mr. Dunbar.
It's all right, Mr. Chair. My comments will be for later.
Okay. All right. Any other discussion about items that under A, the Health Policy Committee? Ms. Zalatow.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just as a general question, what does our legislative packet look like? How specific is it?
Well, in past years, it's been specific as to for which project that we were trying to get funding for, and whether it was for design or construction or whatever. But these legislative priorities that we're talking about would be bills that would need to be introduced, or amendments to existing legislation that we'd be asking for. And so our lobbyists would probably be given a list of items and they would possibly try to find someone to sponsor that bill or amendment, or if that's something we possibly might do before they head to Juneau, if we have know a person on a specific committee that we think that might work out well. Mr. Dunbar?
Yeah, actually, I was going to ask this. So, Jason, or whomever, Meg, last year we had, I think the last 2 years, we had basically several page document with little paragraphs for each of them. So I was going to ask Jason, is that your plan this time? And what's the time frame for when you guys are going to bring your initial draft legislative program?
Through the chair, yes, that is essentially what we do. It's typically anywhere from a 5 to 7 page Word document that lists the general priorities. Typically on the capital side, the only capital side one we've had has been ports, and then there are the smaller kind of more legislative changes that we want to see in a whole bunch of different areas, and typically, I think this is explained it accurately, where we typically have 1 or 2 paragraphs kind of explaining why we want that change and then what the changes that we want to see. And then to answer the other question, my hope would be that probably the first or second meeting in December we'll have something in pace in front of the assembly for you guys to.
Well, I think in the last couple of years, before you put it into PACE, you've come to us, like the initial Word document, right? So because then we can add or subtract before
Yep.
it goes to PACE.
Yep. And I think this is part of what this meeting is me
Yeah.
getting a
What you
sense
go in it.
of what you guys want, so that I can start including some of that in now.
Yep.
But yes, I'm happy to have a meeting in early December for the fully fleshed out draft.
Okay. Well, and we've got a copy of the 2018 legislative program that I'm passing around, so you can look as what the requests used to look like, and I guess we could call the good old days, maybe. Well, actually, the state didn't have money that year either, but,
Ms. Corporation?
Ms. Quinn Davidson?
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Mr. Chair, did they fund 0% of our requests, or did they fund anything?
I believe, I'm not sure, 2018?
2018, we received the actual one large capital grant that we've received in the last 5 years. It was $20 million
Report.
Great.
So it wasn't a total loss?
Yeah, it's good. 1 out of 15 ate that.
3 years of that you've been for.
And if anyone would like a copy of that, we can have that emailed to you so you can take a look at that if possible. All right, we're about 15 minutes into the meeting. Let's move down and we can go to the B, Ethics and Election Committee. And this is something that we discussed at our previous meeting. And you may be wondering, what is a stamp a thing of value? Well, yeah, it's 50 cents or 52 or 51 or whatever they are now. But the question when we're talking about a stamp as a thing of value when we're dealing with a vote by mail election is some states that have vote by mail allow groups to send out stamps to voters so that the voters don't have to use their own stamp. Or they might possibly send someone door to door with stamps to advocate for an item that's on the ballot, and then if they think that person might be voting for that item, they would give them a stamp. And so, and we checked with the legal department last year to see if the municipality of Anchorage considered a stamp a thing of value, and actually what we found out was, according to APOC, it is a thing of value. And so for us to allow groups or candidates to provide stamps to voters for their vote by mail ballot would need a change in code at the state level. And so that's why that item is listed there. And if there's any questions about that, we could delve into that deeper if that's possible. But I think it's fairly self-explanatory. And so we can go to the next item, and that's permanent absentee voter registration. And when I checked into that, what I found out is there are 7 states that already have that: Arizona, California, Hawaii, Minnesota, Montana, New Jersey, and Utah, that allow a person to fill out one application and get a permanent absentee ballot sent to them every election. Now, their names will be taken off the list in some of those states if they fail to return their ballot by election day in both the primary and the general election, register to vote in another state, or fail to keep their registration updated. In other words, if they move to another part of town or another district in that state and don't update the voter registration, when vote by mail elections, we usually send out a postcard several months before the election to find out if that person that's registered at that address is still at that address, because we don't really want to send them a ballot to an address that they don't live at, because those ballots are not forwarded. And so we are in the process of sending our postcard out for our April election. It's going to be coming out fairly soon. And so we give people a chance to review that, and those cards actually are forwarded. So if their card comes to them at their current address, then they don't have to do anything. But if it goes and gets forwarded to them to another address, whether it's in-state or out-of-state, or in-city or out-of-city, then that's an encouragement for them to update their voter registration. Mr. Weddleton?
You know, it seems odd, the permanent absentee, the kind of complaints I've heard are people who live outside Alaska, maybe completely moved, and you could set yourself up with this permanent absentee, and you'd always get the ballot. You can vote the ballot even though you're living in another state and long gone. And it's the sense I get from people nervous about vote by mail is you're getting it mailed and you have to re-up every single time. It's like heading the other way. So is this something you would recommend, or you're just looking into the
Well, and actually when I did a Google on this, I found out that Alaska does have permanent absentee voter registration, but you have to provide a reason. And the first 7 states that I mentioned, you can register for permanent absentee voter ballots without any reason. But Alaska and Connecticut, Delaware, Kansas, Massachusetts, Mississippi, and West Virginia require that you provide a reason. You know, maybe it's a medical problem, maybe you're a snowbird, you know, maybe you had to go down to Lower 48 to take care of aging parents, whatever it is. And I actually haven't looked to see what the list of reasons that are allowable are in Alaska. But this is something that has actually changed. I don't think we had, I think this has passed since I was in the legislature, because I remember the late Max Gruenberg and I introducing legislation to the State Affairs Committee several times when I was in the legislature, advocating for permanent absentee voter registration.
So we don't need to request it because it's already done.
It is, but we could advocate for them to amend that so that people could do it for any reason. They wouldn't have to provide a reason why they want it. It could be just because. Would be a good enough reason. And so, Jason?
I would just add, I think the 2 main reasons that are allowed under Alaska law right now are you have to be able to show that you live in a lot of places in rural Alaska, it's very difficult terrain, or it's hard to get to a polling place, things like that. You can ask, or if you live in a nursing home or some other retirement home where you that's I think they refer to as aged or disability home.
Outside of the state.
No, in the state. You can be added to a permanent absentee voter list.
So, okay. So if you lived in West Anchorage, but you're the home you live in is East Anchorage, you can still go to West Anchorage Valley. Is that what
I don't know how that necessarily works. I just know the 2 kind of very broad reasons that you can request a permanent absentee ballot are those 2 reasons.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, any additional additional discussion about either of these items from the Ethics and Election Committee? Do we feel either of these are something that we want to continue to push for, or is it too soon to have made any kind of group decision on that yet? Any feedback, Mr. Weddleton?
I guess mine to repeat is permanent absentee. If you're within Anchorage, I guess I don't care once I pointed it. But I'm more inclined to say if you're outside of Anchorage and you want an absentee or you want a mail-in ballot, you need to re-up every single year. And I want to hear why.
Yeah.
Mr. Gardner.
I disagree with that. I think in Anchorage, we have resolved this issue by going to vote by mail. But in a lot of other parts of the state, they have not. And actually, and even in Anchorage, for the state, they are still poll-based, which means, for example, in the many retirement homes in my community, they are not physically able, in some cases, to make it to the polls. And I don't think that person should have, for those elderly folks, I don't think every year they need to keep proving that they are still there. I think it helps them. Frankly, what it is one step closer to vote by mail for the state as a whole. One small step, but a step that I think is positive. And again, in Anchorage, for a municipal election, it doesn't matter anymore because we've resolved this issue. But I think the state still is.
No, because we mail quite a number outside of Anchorage.
No, but maybe we're talking about different things. Like, there are no absentee ballots in Anchorage anymore in our municipal elections.
Oh, I see, because you're specifically, yeah. So I'm thinking ballots in general. If someone
Right.
wants one mailed outside of Anchorage, I want to hear why. People are getting them who haven't been registered.
Fair enough, but I think, unless I'm mistaken, this is about the state elections, right? The state poll-based elections.
Well, if we're talking about making
Yeah,
a change to state law to allow everyone in the state to file a permanent absentee voter
Then it gets to
status.
Forrest's point. So I understand what I was looking a little different. So,
Yeah.
but since we do vote by mail, everybody's an absentee voter. Why are you even diving into this? It's not our issue.
Well, it is our issue insofar as we have folks that live in Anchorage that also vote in state elections, if that makes sense.
And believe it or not, some people are actually a little bit confused. It's because they're thinking that they kind of like this vote by mail idea, and then come November of even numbered years, they have to go back to the old poll-based voting, and it's like Back to the Future, so to speak, and they may not be totally enthusiastic about that. Dean?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention two things. One is we have right now in our election code, Title 28, a permanent absentee status, but it only says that a voter may choose permanent absentee status if the state of Alaska provides the option for state elections and the immunity at our level. And right now we don't have that at the state. So that's why we believe this statute amendment probably could actually implement this. It's already in our code. And I think the second thing is, I think it's useful for people who are allowed to be absentee college students who are gone for 4 years, or for becoming a doctor, 12 years, or whatever, or the military that are deployed for several years. I think that they're allowed to go absentee for still residents here. So I guess that's a useful tool for them, as opposed to having to request absence ballot on time in advance of the election every bill.
So we're requesting this change so that the state law and our law would be aligned?
Yeah.
Okay. Ms. Kennedy?
Well, I was just kind of going to follow along with what Dean said in regard to military. I mean, you can have your Alaska residency forever, as long as you're active in the military and moving around and haven't switched to another state. So it'd be nice, if you're going to have 2 or 3 more assignments before you come back to Alaska, to have yourself on that permanent registration list. And the other thing is, it's my understanding, and somebody can correct me, but it's my understanding that we can't send anything out of state from a municipality unless it's actually been requested as an absentee voter ballot. So that's why we do those, that's why we mail out those little cards that say, you know, if you've got any problem with this, if you're receiving this in error or whatever, you know, whatever's on that card. I mean, I think they were all sent out today, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, I think they are.
But that's one of the ways that we track to make sure that we're actually sending in the municipality or to people who have specifically requested the absentee ballot because they're out of state, because they're out of the municipality. So there's several things going on, I think, with all of this. So it's probably worth having the state do what they need to do so that we can figure out how to do what we want to do.
Okay. Jason?
I just want to add, I found in Alaska Administrative Code the three areas that you can qualify is the election supervisor determines that the voter resides in a remote area in Alaska where distance, terrain, or other natural conditions deny the voter reasonable access to the polling place. The voter has identified an institution in the state serving the aged or persons with disabilities as a permanent residence on his or her current registration card, or the voter is a disabled voter and is requested to be designated a permanent absentee voter. Those are currently the three.
And what was the last one?
The voter is a disabled voter and is requested to be designated a permanent absentee voter.
Okay. All right.
So that's pretty narrow, actually.
That is fairly narrow.
Thank you.
Okay, any other discussion about either of these items? Not seeing any. I guess we'll move on to C. This was from the Enterprise Utility Oversight Committee. Maintain the Port of Alaska as the highest capacity priority of the municipality and the state. Anyone, any of the co-chairs from that committee want to start a discussion about that, or any questions about that?
I think it speaks for itself,
Yeah.
and we've spent a lot of time on the topic. We've seen some small federal investment. We need to continue to focus on the Port of Alaska. We're working with AML to ensure it's more broad, so that it might be received better, that it's a statewide port question, and so that's the gist.
Right, and so we have a resolution that we've drawn up that we're going to hope to introduce at the annual meeting when AML's in town in November. And Mr. Rivera and Ms. LaFrance and I are going to be sending copies of that to members of AML, hopefully this weekend, to at least start the discussion. Because to introduce that, we need 5 other jurisdictions to be on board with it, and then we can have a robust discussion at the AML conference as to whether they think that's something that they want to pass and add to their list of resolutions. Mr. Dunbar?
Yeah, I have 2 things. One, so I agree with that approach, that the Port of Alaska remains our highest priority. I think we have, in the last couple of weeks, really, it's been thrown into stark relief, a point that Mr. Weddleton often makes. I know Mr. Constant also is involved in AMATs about the impact of these highway projects and these large state road projects on the municipality, and that they are no longer, when they plan a road project, like obviously the one that's going under Scooter Vanguard, that they need to budget for the ancillary effects onto the municipal roads, and not assume that they are going to basically, and we all have experienced this now, our state house reps are now asking us to put things on the bond instead of coming to us with potential capital projects. And they are continuing to shift those costs. So now their new paradigm is, well, we'll put in this project and all the ancillary stuff, we'll let them bond for that. And I don't know, this is more just that I'd like to hear the administration talk about this when you bring your proposal here, but talking about a way to hopefully resolve that, where either one, some of these old legacy projects, we talk about not doing them, right? Because we can no longer afford the ancillary costs. And some of them are bad projects to begin with, like the one they're currently forcing on us. Or 2, that they change their paradigm where it's included in their budget. Like Academy Vanguard should have been part of the budget for that project. I think it was at one point and it was taken out. Okay, someone told me recently that it was and it was removed. Whatever it was, we need to ask them, and maybe it's a state legislative change that forces those kind of projects to include the total cost of the project and and not assume that they can force it on the municipality. Although, to me, of course, the preferred solution in that case is they just do not do the project. Anyway, so I'd like something like to hear some thoughts on that for the administration when you do your legislative program. And perhaps we can never get the appropriate level of unanimity to make it, but I'd like to hear a discussion about it.
Well, and in the past, we saw it, or local government saw it as a good deal, because they were, if it goes through AMATS, they're allowed to get up to 90% federal money, and then the state has some, and then the local jurisdiction puts some in, but it's not a large amount. As it turns out, when they built the overpass over the Muldoon Road over the Glen Highway, originally we had put $15 million on a bond, and thought that might be, in the ballpark for what the state's share of fixing that would be. And once we found out that the height of the overpass was shorter than federal standards, that's when AMATS kicked in, and so 90% of that was paid for by federal dollars, and the rest of it was paid for out of the state grant. So the Muni actually had to put very little funding in for that overpass project. But now that we here in Anchorage find ourselves in a very tight budget situation, and we're no longer having capital projects funded by the state, it makes it more difficult for us to meet even the small part of a $250 million project, or whatever the Vanguard one is. If we had to come up with 10% of that, that's $25 million. And so a lot of times we have $30 million on our road project bond, so that'd be, 75–80% of our road projects would be on that one project that we're not real crazy about it being completed in the first place. So, anyway, Mr. Constantine.
On that topic, it's, whether you think of it as good faith, bad faith, or anything, what's happening now is a product of the state's changing tides, our changing tides, but also the fact that many of these projects were planned and started 20 years ago, right? We heard testimony, it was 2001, and we saw documentation of this Vanguard project beginning. And so the climate in Alaska in 2001 was wholesale different than it is now. And so all of the things that we've heard are important variables to consider. But what that also speaks to is that there is probably 10 to 15 years of projects that are in the queue right now working their way toward implementation that we're going to find ourselves in the same position on. And so although one project is important to look at in the context of if you're going to do this, you need to pay for it. We know they can't pay for it, and they're going to continue doing their project. What we need to do is advocate for a process that reinvestigates all of those 15 years of projects that are on the train moving forward, and some that are at their 50% more that are coming to us that we can't afford. And how are we going to have a relationship with them if their only answer is, we're going to do this to you one way or the other? And so to me, we have to look closely at that continuum of projects, not just any one specific project.
I agree. That's sort of what I was getting at. This is one really stark example, but this is why it's a legislative request, right? It's not just that way. We need some kind of process to do what we just described.
Because we can't afford it.
Mr. Weddleton?
Yeah, I think that makes sense, and actually, I think it's a great idea to look at future projects, see what might be coming, similar damage. But I'd be nervous putting that in front of the legislature, because there's a process they're not even really as involved with. It's this federal funding process that has lots of rules, and it's so it's more making sure the state follows those rules. And some of those rules have changed, I think, within the last 10 years, and that's that when you do your EIS, it has to be a complete project. You can't have it. This was clearly an incomplete project, the Academy Band part. So I'd just be nervous sort of a bunch of legislators, especially if they say, okay, we'll solve Anchorage's problem.
Yeah.
You won't spend any money there.
Yeah, I could certainly see that happening as well. Mr. Dunbar?
Well, maybe this is for the administration to ponder as well, I think. perhaps it's not like we're going to ask the legislature to go project by project or anything like that, but some kind of state legislative change that requires DOT to be more accountable to localities. Because right now, I don't think that they are very accountable. And I'm not sure how you would phrase that exactly. I don't know. Chris, are you shaking your head at my idea or about the idea that they're not very accountable?
Well, Mr.
agreeing with you that they're not very accountable.
Right.
Mr. Schutte is on AMATS, and so he could probably weigh in here if he wanted to. What do you think about this subject that we've been discussing?
Through the chair, I think that there's a definite disconnect that occurs between DOT's planning, which is statewide and is actuated through what's known as their statewide transportation plan, the STIP, and how that trickles down to the communities, or at least particularly to the more developed communities and the goals that those communities may have. So take, for example, Fairbanks with FMATs or Anchorage with AMATs. We have populations that sustain a local metropolitan planning organization for transportation, and they exist in a somewhat symbiotic relationship with the state, but largely it is subservient to the STIP, to the statewide transportation plan. And I think that's where a lot of this disconnect occurs. There's not a lot of visibility into the STIP, unlike the AMATS planning process for our TIP and for our MTP, which has very robust public participation and public involvement in preparing. The STIP is only open to the mandatory federal public comment period. It does not regularly enjoy daylight during the creation of it. And I think that's what ultimately leads to a lot of this conflict. They're able to stay focused on their own internal goals and objectives and not be as, I think, responsive to public requests and public need as, say, some of the AMATs or some of the municipalities trying to take the project.
Well, and I think that the people of Independence Park, if they would have had their say, I don't believe they would have been voting in favor of 14,000 additional cars a day zipping right through the north part of their neighborhood, which is what this particular project would end up causing. Mr. Constant?
The other shift that we're seeing, I think that we're seeing, is that DOT is pulling a lot more projects under their internal umbrella, which is a lot of the projects used to be out kind of in different contract fields and in local communities to do the work, but their engineers are hungry for work because their budgets are shrinking. And so their priorities that they're going to continue working on are going to be even harder to intervene with because these are, I don't want to be disparaging, but these are their bread and butter, right? And so it's getting tight enough that their own departments are starting to feel the pinch. That to me is one area we're going to have to be very conscientious of.
Well, Ms. Kennedy and then Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I want to just kind of echo a little bit of what Mr. Constant just said, the idea that it seems like in some respects DOT is kind of pushing some of these things because there is, I'm sure there's a sense that there's a backlog and they want to kind of keep moving and keep people employed and those are all good things. But I've seen this kind of backfire in Eagle River recently because we've had a big traffic mitigation plan for I don't know how long, over 10 years probably. And when the bridge got hit and got shut down, the DOT decided that Glen Highway then needed some other kind of way to deal with potential shutdowns in that area. So now we have a whole new access road that's going to run along the place where they're putting the new bridge, which goes in next summer. So there will be 2 new bridges to go with the 2 old bridges across the Glen Highway, across the actual Eagle River. But what it's done is it's changed the impact to how we can proceed for our traffic mitigation. If you've ever come off that main Eagle River exit, it's just kind of an awkward intersection that basically backs up, and we can even have people still on the highway trying to get off the Glen Highway, even with 3 lanes there now. But anyway, what DOT decided to do, because it was just becoming such an amazingly confused way forward, that they just put the brakes on all of it. They said, we're just going to stop. And so we get a chance to go back and rethink everything. We've got some property that was probably potential eminent domain property, but it was repurchased by a church that has since remodeled. They're not, now they're building up this property that probably 10 years ago, they should have attained the right of way, should have purchased it outright. So anyway, so a lot of things have changed, and so my concern, and in DOT's defense, is they kind of backed off and said, okay, we need to wait, we need to rethink this. But I think that's exactly what could be happening in a lot of other projects. If you're just, okay, we're going full speed ahead, blinders on both sides, then you don't really understand the impact of a project you thought was good 20 years ago may not be the same answer today. And I know that can absolutely delay having anything done, but at the same time, you've got to be responsive enough to come up with good solutions, not just do what you thought you should have done 20 years ago. So anything we can do to help really watch some of these projects down the road, and if we need to say, hey, wait a minute on this one, then we ought to be able to do that. And I know sometimes that frustrates people, but at the same time, my biggest concern was we were going to put $6.5 million into a project that was going to get torn up as soon as DOT comes through and redoes that entire intersection. So we have to work with the Glen Highway and Little Eagle River's, access. But anyway, so anything we can do, like I said, to make sure that we are ahead of the game, so to speak, and we're up with the times. We're not just doing something that we thought we should have done 15 or 20 years ago. We need to be able to do that and make those kinds of input.
And along those same lines, this particular project on Vanguard that we've been talking about has been on the long-term plan for quite a while. And the reason that it originally was put on there is because of the traffic problems at Diamond and Old Seward. Well, they've actually made some improvements in that area, and so the number of cars that would potentially be using this Academy Drive change is probably less than it would have been 10 years ago. And so the question comes up to, and we've kind of brought this up at AMATS, is this still necessary? And with the additional improvements they plan to make further south along the new Seward, maybe it's not necessary to reroute all this traffic through this area and buy up all these properties along that route. And Mr. Wells.
If we, I'd almost think in our discussion here is the request about not doing incomplete projects should really go to our federal representatives, but something that we could send to our legislature is kind of value more decreasing operation costs, because they're really getting hammered on their operating side. When they build these things, they add a new lane, they substantially increase their operating costs. When you put a new tunnel in, they have to maintain that. These huge roundabouts, which I really like, but those are much harder to maintain. And I don't know that they're valuing that in their construction.
Or they're dumping that on us.
Well, there's their state roads, though. They're the ones who are.
The main construction is the state road on a massive thoroughfare, but every link off of it is ours, and we own the maintenance and operations forever.
We also are now in active conversations with them because they've been so terrible about removing snow. The last couple of years, we've just been doing it. We're talking to them about doing it, right? I mean, it's the operations. It's a good point.
Mr. Rivera.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, seeing our time, I was wondering if I have 4 other things on the list that I'd like for us to consider. I'll rattle them off, and then I'll let you, Mr. Chair, sort of decide how to have the discussion.
Mr. Rivera, could I just, before we quit that topic, say what I think we ought to consider doing, separate from the legislative program, is create a Muni DOT working group that begins a conversation about all of these topics, kind of in a less costly or consequential setting than in an AMATS or in a official work session capacity. Work with the administration, a couple members of the body, and begin a conversation with DOT about how to iron some of this out. Because we didn't do it just now. We just raised all the questions we're all considering, and we're not going to do it through our legislature. No, AMATS is a very specific job with local roads and state roads, and so I think I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be blunt, but
Okay, no, that's fine.
I would just
I'm trying to figure out,
recommend.
if you guys are on the AMATS committee, is that the?
So it's more of a long-term planning
Okay.
instrument.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's one of the feeders.
Okay.
The STIP is another feeder. Our road projects are another one. It's like there's a whole bunch going on here, and it begs for a small working group between the parties to come up with a way to have this conversation meaningfully.
Sign me up.
Sorry.
Did you have anything additional, Mr. Dunbar?
Oh, I have my own topic like Felix, so I'll go after him.
Okay, and did you have your hand up, Ms. Quinn Davidson?
No, I didn't.
Okay. Mr. Weddle.
Just to follow that a little bit, we do have to, I mean, we have to be careful who's on that team.
Right.
Because if you have, if it were Pete, myself, and Chris, well, then we have a quorum for the AMAS policy, we can't do that.
Right.
We can't, the three of us meet, but, so whoever, I mean, you probably could.
I can, and Chris, you and I can talk, or Jason, and we can come up with a way for this to work. We just need to have a place for this conversation that's less consequential than AMATs or us getting steamrolled. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Rivera.
Thanks. So, the 4 topics that I was hoping the group would consider. First is, are there any specific legislative requests regarding homelessness? Second, any specific legislative requests regarding public safety? Third, do we want to add back in the discussion, which it has been included in many prior legislative requests regarding property tax exemptions? And then fourth, just sort of a general philosophical discussion of, and the administration has, I think, had this discussion as well, of what's the right size of the legislative program. Do we want to put everything in it? Do we want a more centralized, smaller legislative program? That last one, I imagine this isn't going to be our only meeting on this, so we can leave that last one for a future topic.
What was your third one?
Property tax exemptions.
Property tax exemptions.
Can I add one?
Sure.
The education formula. Mr. Trainee wanted to talk about that, and I think we should bring that back up again. Just the formula and how it's calculated. It hasn't been reviewed in a long time.
Can of worms.
Well, and so, Jason, you're sort of here representing the administration. Do you have any similar items like this on your current perspective ask from the state?
Yes, I would assume that we would have something that would fall into these categories.
And so we would be instructing our lobbyists to try to work these items in Juneau, or would the plan be for members of the Assembly to try to work with legislators ahead of time to possibly find them to maybe introduce pieces of legislation that would do some of these items? What do you think?
I think historically we've done a little bit of both, where there's been lines where Assembly members have gone down and spoken to individual legislators that they might have relationships with. But I would say that I think the bulk of the work kind of pushing these items is done by the lobbyists that we do have on contract with UNIF.
And so are we still going to be sticking with the same lobbyists? Do we know at this point?
I don't believe that there's been any decisions made on that yet.
Okay, all right. Mr. Dunbar.
Yeah, so both in response to Mr. Rivera and then my own, what I was going to bring up, I would suggest that we do not spend more time on the property tax exemptions thing. We've requested many times. The low-hanging fruit, which was the sprinklers, we actually got passed. And the real important work on that now is actually the work that we're doing it ourselves as a municipality, which is our assessors going back and evaluating who is wrongly claiming these. I never thought it was realistic that we were going to tax churches, for example, and I think we need to stop pretending like that's going to happen. So I would just recommend not going down that road. On public safety, and Pete and I didn't have this conversation, so I didn't want to make it a representation of the Public Safety Committee. But I am going to propose a local ordinance, and I believe Ms. Zalatel and Mr. Weddleton will be co-sponsoring it with me if we can find the appropriate language, to remove the by name search in our property tax database for victims of domestic violence. And it might be survivors of domestic violence. And it might end up being everyone. I'm not sure how it's going to look exactly, which is what they did in Fairbanks. But Alex Slifka has made clear to me that we cannot do it on our own locally. We also need a state legislative change. So I hope we pass that locally and we get the state legislative change. Because we've all been contacted by people who are either themselves survivors or advocates for the survivors, and that ability to search by name on our website right now is really problematic. So that's something I'd like to change.
Ms. Altel?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have one that goes to both property tax exemption and homelessness that's combined. I would like to explore property tax exemption for permanent supportive housing units for scatter site type housing. If
Increasing the number.
yes, so if a fourplex or a duplex is going to be used for purposes of permanent supportive housing, that there be a property tax exemption allowed. So it's a little bit more refined. I understand where Mr. Dunbar is coming from, but this is really narrow, and I think it could benefit the ability to potentially create more housing units without having to do maybe capital investments into the community to build a single site. I know there will be some of those that may be run by nonprofits, but it opens up the spectrum of potential housing available.
So to be clear, I think what Mr. Rivera was referencing was the Budget Advisory Commission before sort of the new leadership for years they asked us to not create new ones but remove old property tax exemptions. So they wanted us to, for example, take away the property tax exemptions for nonprofits.
I want to create a new one.
Yeah, so that's a much more productive discussion, I think.
Mr. Weddleton?
I just want to check out if we can do as many as we want. We're not limited.
No, that's not true, right?
We have to do what the state says, but we can also do more.
Only if it's
Downtown.
authorized under state law.
That's what my understanding was as well. And I had a brief conversation with Mr. Judy about there's some limitations.
Yeah.
Yeah, to the chair, there are, without knowing the full details of the permanent supportive housing, I can't say one way or the other right now, but there's flexibility from a couple of state law changes that we initiated 2 or 3 years ago. So there actually may be a local path forward for this Valcal proposal that we need to work with.
And so then, we currently have houses throughout Anchorage. I've actually come across some when I was walking through neighborhoods over the weekend where, they're taking care of, disabled individuals or whatever. Does the property owner, do they get a tax exemption for having one of that facility in their
So,
building?
Chair, without knowing any specifics about the properties that you visited, all I can say is that if it's a property in which they reside, they are eligible for the residential exemption outright, which is a pretty sizable one. For any exemptions beyond that, including the senior citizen exemption or anything else, I'd need more details.
Okay. All right, thank you. And Mr. Gates?
So speaking of property tax exemptions, for some issues like religious and charities, they're in the Constitution, so some of those you can't remove. And then the statute for property taxes in Title 29, 45, the way it's structured, there's a section that's required exemptions that you have to provide. If you want to remove them, you need to remove that statute. Then there's options for property tax exemptions. You need to amend that if you want to add something. It's not currently in that list. And so some of them, for example, what Mr. Dunbar was talking about, you need to add to that statute before we can implement that kind of property tax exemption.
And so we would need a change in state statute to do that?
Yes, municipalities have to comply with that chapter for property taxes, and if it's not in there, to amend it.
All right, Ms. LaFrance?
Oh, thank you, Mr. Peterson. So a different item that we've included in the past, TNCs. You want to put that one back on, Transportation Network Companies and Local Control?
I think it would be great if we'd be able to have a little more local control over those. Right now, it's kind of the Wild West. They just do their own thing, and we're not doing any inspecting. And so I don't know. I wouldn't have a problem with that. I don't know if we're going to get anywhere or not. What does the committee feel about that idea? Because we'd be asking for a code change. Mr. Gates and then Mr. Weddleton.
I've worked on this in the past, and the preemption provision from the municipalities regulating TNCs is one of the broadest road preemption sections I've ever seen, and I think it goes too far. So there should at least be some allowance for some limited local regulations on a consistent state statute regulating TNCs. That would be more common.
So maybe we should possibly work on an amendment and try to find a legislator to introduce that maybe.
Yeah, I would recommend it.
Okay. Mr. Weddleton.
I don't know, I guess now that after Dean kind of spoke, it does kind of tick me off that they totally preempted us. But I'd say in general, if we heard any problems, it's like we'd be attacking a problem that may not exist. And I see them out there. I haven't heard them clogging up our downtown streets or anything. Maybe I'm just missing it.
Yeah, if I might, they've been taking up taxi cab reserved spots. They don't pay any kind of taxation to the municipality. They are wide open in terms of their security. They claim to be background checking people that aren't. And so I know that the Senate Minority Leader would carry something if we propose it to him.
What's that?
Senate Minority Leader would.
Was that right?
Yeah, he and I have had lengthy discussions. Having some form of local control is important. I'm not suggesting we should ask them to eliminate all, but some local control is really, because they've basically eliminated all.
Right, and just looking at something here, municipalities should be authorized at a minimum to require TNC drivers to register, pass a fingerprint background check, and carry a minimum level of insurance is what we consider sort of the minimum that we would find acceptable.
Yeah, in fact, if I might, one last note, Mr. Weddleton, have you bought an insurance policy for your car lately?
I do it every year, and I have to admit it's like an automatic.
Right, so every time now they ask you, are you using this car for
Really?
some kind of a ride-sharing service? Why? Because people are, and they're not insuring themselves for their business, and they're wrecking someone else's life, and they have no insurance to cover it. It's so bad now that insurance companies are actually saying, you can't do this. And so, for sure, there are mathematically established problems.
Well, and these TNC companies are not calling these people employers, they're independent contractors, and therefore they pay no workman's compensation, no health insurance, no unemployment insurance, withholding taxes, none of that. And so, what I find hard to believe is that the TNC companies are reporting they're not making any profits, and they're not really paying their employees or paying them the way a normal business would. So I'm wondering where all the money's going myself. Just
No successful business ever made $1.
oh, I see. All right. Well, on that notion, are there any other discussions we should have? We're down to the last minute or two here. Any other items we want to talk about? If not, we'll go to the audience participation part of this meeting. Mr. Haberman, are you participating? Okay.
My name is Eugene Carl Haberman. It's in the Valley. Most of my normal introduction, just basically say this. I heard reference to AMAX several times. I'm sorry Wellington is not here for these comments, because he's on the AMAX program, and he just stepped out a long time. Nothing against him, but this is pertinent to me to be here. Number one, I couldn't help but not miss Senator Constance reference to another discussion dealing with transportation sidebar, basically a working group on transportation. I'd like to remind you, back in the days when George Sullivan was here as mayor, which I was present at the AMAX meetings with Mayor Sullivan, George Sullivan, not Dan. That's how far I go back. That's how long AMAX has been around with the municipality of Anchorage. That's a long time. But to set up another way to go around AMAX and not deal with AMAX, and note this, AMAX parties that are on that deal include the state, not just assembly members, but state. And so I'm concerned about going around instead of being there and having that discussion. And note this, at the last AMAX that I'm aware of, there was no notice for the meeting upstairs. And I had a 20-minute discussion with the one responsible to explain to him where the notices were supposed to be. Now, there was where you have the assembly agenda, so forth, for the regular meeting. You know that area, you're familiar with it. But you're all, hopefully all familiar with the public notice site. The agenda in AMAX was over where you would see the agenda for your meeting in the SAC, but there was no notice for that. And I had a 20-minute discussion after that. So what I'm concerned is, and there was concern, you know, we're talking about projects dealing with Eagle River, Glen, the disruption in the future, how are we going to deal with these issues respectfully? And when I say we, remember, there's a lot of traffic going through that bottleneck that collapsed, you know. And it was that collapse and not caused by the earthquake, that caused by a truck that went over higher than they should have been. That caused a very serious situation, and look how we dealt with it. So, don't go around, please. Bring the parties that are already there and the public, get connected and do it. A program that's been established way back when George Sullivan was mayor. Thank you.
Okay, we are adjourned.